It's a delight and an honor to be here and to be with you. It's November, the month of saints, large and quite ordinary, and I sense the women I will be speaking about this morning were very much at the synod that some of us were privileged to participate in last month. Listening intently, laughing, crying, noticing, and so happy to see women in many capacities at the synod. They would have approved of the men there as well. I dedicate this to them because for me, they led the way. The call for renewal for women religious actually came before Vatican II, and it begins with Pope Pius XII. The journey for the women in the United States and the group that is now called LCWR, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, began at the behest of Pope Pius XII. In 1950, 12 years before Vatican II began, he convoked the First General Congress of the States of Perfection. We don't use that word anymore. An international gathering of the leaders of religious orders. He told them that organizing and collaborating together, they could be a powerful instrument for the transformation of society. But the women first needed some updating. So the women he was calling on to have both educational updating, spiritual updating, and an updating in what was happening in the world. In 1952, there was another gathering, the National Congress of the Religious of the United States. And here were the heads of women and men religious congregations. And to the meeting came Father Arcadio Larraona, Secretary of the Sacred Congregation of Religious, to speak of a movement that will require change. At then the First World Congress of the Mothers General of Pontifical Right, held that September, Larraona asks women what their founders would do if confronted with the needs of the world today. So the women started asking, again, what is God calling us to do now? And realizing the church is also inviting this. But the women were not yet convinced of a need to create an organization such as this. But on November 24th, 1956, more than 235 heads of women's orders in the United States met in Chicago to decide whether to form this national conference. The Vatican Congregation for Religious had now asked. Although there was ambivalence about the need for the conference, a comment from the floor proved to be a turning point in the decision-making process. And it's been used in enough different publications that it must be so. It says, Rome wishes it, and as obedient children of the church, there should be no hesitancy in forming it, unquote. Mary Daniel Turner, a sister of Notre Dame de Namur, who will prove to be a major figure in the renewal of religious life in the United States, was the one who used that quote as she was sharing years later. What was it that moved people at that point? So we'll see that decades later, that wasn't the same question. The conference then began, the CMSW, the Conference of Major Superiors of Women, whose mission was threefold. Promote spiritual welfare of women religious in the U.S., that's the spiritual life. Ensure increasing efficacy in the apostolate, that was ministry and responding to the signs of the times. And 3, foster closer fraternal cooperation with all religious of the U.S., hierarchy, clergy, and Catholic associations. Collaboration was being invited. What we hear Mary Daniel Turner say is the conference's founding was born out of a vision of renewal or aggiornamento. This vision sparked new life even before Vatican II. Conference members were challenged to wake up, look around, and see the world in which they lived. The mandate for renewal became an imperative to risk seeing what God is asking and gracing us to do right here and now. The conference was also born out of a vision of collaboration. Through the conference, the often reality of separation, isolation, and subtle competitiveness that had distinguished congregations of women religious were transformed more and more into relationships marked by passion for the commonweal of the church and the world. So something was shifting. And one of the lines there is that they learned that holiness, both social and personal, is distinguished by relationships marked by judicious and sagacious uses of power, unquote. And yet, even before 1956, something else was moving that brought women religious to the point of readiness for the council, or maybe even ran a little ahead of some of the areas of the council. And that was the Sisters Formation Conference. It began in 1954, and it came out of a need for women religious to get educated. Many religious women who taught in schools went on the Saturday plan, and that was they taught all week, and on Saturdays for 19 years perhaps, 10 years if they were fortunate, did their university studies. Something had to shift. But there was also a need for the sisters to get updated on theology on all these areas. And so from Margaret Brennan, an IHM sister who was president, who's a theologian, we hear, quote, from the early 50s, the Sister Formation Conference through the NCEA, the National Conference of Education Association, had drawn women educators together from many diverse congregations for the purpose of seeking the advancement of the religious, cultural, and professional formation of sisters. By means of conferences, educational programs, and sister formation bulletins that reach countless women religious in the U.S. in their convent residences, the sisters of the 50s were reading and discussing articles by Congar, De Lubac, Karl Rahner, Bernard Häring, and other theologians who would deeply influence the Vatican Council as periti. I have some pictures I forgot. This is just where we're going. But this is one of the sister formation bulletins, and it's an essay on conscience formation of religious by Bernard Häring. So I conclude with this quote with Margaret Brennan saying, as a result of such reading and study, I believe that as a whole, no group of persons in the U.S. was better prepared to receive the teaching of Vatican II than women religious, unquote. So how do women religious get to the Vatican? Well, it's actually your Cardinal Sunins here who was of assistance. In 1962, at the Vatican Council, he noted the absence of women religious. Right? He asked why we are deliberating about church when half of its members were absent. So at one point, 15 were able to come in that large group of bishops and then other lay men. But he noticed that already in 1962, with this wonderful book, The Nun in the Modern World, the absence of women, quote, religious from, quote, the main spheres of influence at the adult level. Spheres where they have a right to be and where their talents are called for and their presence is needed. And he wanted them to be connected also with those who, quote, run the world, create a climate of opinion and atmosphere we all breathe. The adults who in their turn will form or deform the coming generation. So with that intervention and a lot of other pieces that are in the story, in 1964, not only is the first national CMSW conference in which Sister Mary Lou Tobin, a sister of Loreto, is elected the president or national chair of the Conference of Major Superiors of Women in the United States, but their executive committee had a mandate for her. They asked her to go to Rome, quote, to hang out around the halls of the third session of the Second Vatican Council and see what's happening and see how you might contribute. So she took a ship to Rome and found out from a telephone call from a reporter of the New York Times the question, how do you feel about your invitation to attend Vatican II as one of the 15 women who have just been invited? And she said, I'm on a boat. I have no such information. And the word had just come from the Vatican that morning. So leave it to reporters to find a nun in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Of particular interest to women. And I'm going to move. This is some of the people in some of the early sessions. But I'm going to introduce you here to Sister Mary Luke Tobin. Pope Paul VI, on September 8th, 1964, a week before the third session, said at an audience, "We have made arrangements so that some qualified and devout women can be present as auditors at some of the solemn rites and some of the general congregations of the upcoming third session of the Second Vatican Council. We mean those congregations that will be discussing questions of particular interest to women." Mary Luke Tobin tells the story that when she finally got to Rome, one of the laymen interviewing her, the domo in charge of auditors, said that women had been invited in order to participate in those sessions, quote, which would be of interest to them. And Mary Luke Tobin said, I was interested in whatever the bishops were discussing. And all the women said the exact same thing, so they came to everything. What you're starting to see then, as we get into the actual Perfecte Caritatis document, which was already in discussion by then, are going to be issues about obedience, about how do we make the transformation of this time, what's the adaptation, how do we go more deeply into the areas we're being called to. But you're going to notice the call here, and Mary Luke Tobin demonstrates it, is really adulthood. To act as a woman who is an adult and to take her place, even as at times she was given no place. So this is the key piece in here, and it was both Cardinal Doffner and Sunens who advocated for that when that document was being debated and rewritten, that obedience required for religious, quote, should be that of a mature adult, not a child or a servant. Right. And Sunens also was advocating for more linking between religious and laity. So you start having the presence of a woman ask more questions about where women are. And Bishop Hui, Huyghhe, a member of the Perfecte Caritatis Commission, made an intervention that said the commission should consult Superior General of Women's Orders, especially those who have been invited to the council as auditors. Sister Mary Luke Tobin tried, and she was not invited. The women then said, can we at least give you in writing some of our concerns? And they were told yes. And so they at least were able to do that. But it was this moment of how do you offer what it is that you can offer? One of the things that commentators have been saying is that when you look at religious life for women, and particularly here, I'll simply speak in the United States, and even here it's not everyone, but for a majority, it wasn't only Perfecte Caritatis. The women religious read all the documents. Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes were key companions, as well as Ad Gentes. But those first two I mentioned were key companions as women religious were saying, what is our call? And so how do you read the signs of the times? How do you go out to the places where the agonies of the world are as well as the joys? So in reading Lumen Gentium, which does bring in religious life, the evangelical councils, we read in Lumen Gentium 44:2, the evangelical councils which lead to charity join their followers to the church and its mystery in a special way. Already, women religious saw themselves linked to the whole people of God. There was also another place that Gregory Baum, the theologian, and who was at the council, speaks about the linking of love of God and love of neighbor. Because in his commentary on the decree on the renewal of religious life at the Vatican, He talks about chapter 5 and 6 in the universal call to holiness of Lumen Gentium, and how that shifts also now the older viewpoint that the primary purpose of religious life is the seeking of personal perfection, and the secondary purpose is to serve the church in the apostolate. He said, we can't defend that any longer. The two ends of religious life are so intimately connected, they cannot be classified as primary or secondary. Baum also offers a helpful connection to community life, which, when I get to the third part of my presentation, you'll hear the resonances. He talked about being a member of a religious community signifies an enduring commitment to follow Christ more intensely as part of a family dedicated to the service. In this quest, the religious is aided by the community, and they in turn to each other. So here we're reading the document in this, but it's the whole sense of community is going to be, in many different ways, keenly important. Now, I don't want to make it seem that the women were on their own at Vatican II at all. There were many conversations and a good number of bishops who did engage with them, and there's record of that. What's noteworthy for me is that there were periti there who made it a point to sit next to the sisters and translate the Latin to the English for them so that they could understand what was being said. Between the sessions, Mary Luke Tobin came back to the United States and shared what was happening. So there was always this flow of information going back and forth. In Perfecte Caritatis, places that would later become both starting points, jumping points, but also neuralgic points. One of them was obedience in 14 of Perfecte Caritatis. The line about, in professing obedience, religious offer the full surrender of their own will as a sacrifice of themselves to God, and so are united permanently and securely to God's salvific will. There were interventions about that, and one that I found really interesting was Father Buckley's intervention. Quote, today's young people won't swallow archaic formulas, like the will of the superior is exactly the same as the will of God. There has to be a call for renewal in language as well. But the places that were very much part of the ethos of religious life in the United States really looked at paragraph 2, A to E. The ultimate norm of the religious life is the following of Christ set through the Gospels. That allowed women religious to say, where is this being calling us to today? Today, what does this mean? And it was to be the highest rule for the institutes. Right? That institutes should promote among their members an adequate knowledge of the social conditions of the times they live in and the needs of the church. That's D. There were many areas in this that the women said, we can. And then you had the whole adaptation and looking at where you're living, how you're living, small groups. All kinds of areas were opened up. And it really had a lot to do. It didn't come without many tensions and many drafts of who gets to decide what religious will decide and how they're living the call. But what happened, I'm now moving to Vatican, post-Vatican II, and living the council. The first gathering as the council ended for the Sisters' Council had the theme Sisters and the Council. And already there, they had a canon law committee so that the U.S. women religious would have a voice in the revision of canon law. The women that were part of this leadership conference had voice and had vote, and they were not going to go back on that. By 1966, just a year later, congregations were asked to look at their constitutions, go deeply into the spirit of the founder, which really meant the Holy Spirit, what was moving, and Gregory Baum has some beautiful commentary on that it was really looking at what's being asked of us. So go deeply into our sources and look at them for today. Right? So the same call being asked. So ad experimentum was encouraged. But to say not all were pleased with that is probably an understatement. And yet, women religious already had a 10-year leap in moving on some of these areas. And something just disappeared that will come back. 1 second. This is where I love computers, and they make me very nervous. All right. I think this. All right. They have a different version of it, but I think I know where I am. This time of renewal didn't come without some challenges also, both externally and also internally. And I'm just going to name one that Sister Angelita Myerscough, ASC, who is LCWR president, brought forth. And it started giving people a sense that even within the new conference, all things were not equal and all were not satisfied. Within the conference, there was considerable tension. Reflecting the tension, she writes, generated not only within congregations by the renewal called for by Vatican II, but also among congregations. However, those objecting to the thrust of this 1965 assembly, or it's 1971, indicated in the theme, had courteously kept a low profile. And in this theme was the church is for the world. And in addition to having speakers from a variety of places, they also ended up looking at their bylaws. And one of the discussions that had started coming up was, do we want to be the Conference of Major Superiors of Women Religious? Or might we change the title? And so what was offered was, what if we are called instead the Leadership Conference of Women Religious? So removing superior, because then there's an inferior in there, but also leadership, saying that there's vision for going forward. And that came as a bit of a surprise. The consulting committee, the organizing committee, had been talking about it and said, let's just bring this up for a vote, knowing it would surprise people. And this is one of the places where perhaps that kind of surprise wasn't as helpful as it might have been, because they presumed that people would say, this is a wonderful idea. And they had usually done a voice vote, and it was split. And so Sister Angelita had to do what you do in their bylaws, and that is have a paper vote. She says, following our rules of procedure with the written ballot, the result was 186 in favor of being LCWR and 165 opposed, and 5 abstentions. The amendment that changed the CMSW to the LCWR had passed, but only by a slim majority. And there became more and more of the shifts that started happening. And ultimately, and I'm aware of my time right now, what happened over time was, I will quote Margaret Brennan here, she says, we discovered the diverse views of renewal based on differing ecclesiologies in the documents of Vatican II brought pain and internal division between individuals within communities and between communities themselves. From among our own membership, some anxious voices emerged. Were the directions of the conference an authentic expression of renewal? Or were they pointing to an understanding and lived expression of religious life that was itself developing? The tension became concretized in the formation of the Consortium for Perfecte Caritatis, a group of our own members whose orientation to renewal differed both ideologically and theologically. Rome and the Congregation for Religious reacted with alarm and concern. The initial shock of disapproval of the alacrity and enthusiasm with which we took up the direction of the council that had announced its intention to be in the world and for the world left us shocked and initially incredulous. The ideals of the consortium, I can talk about it later, live now in the Council of Major Superiors of Women Religious, which received papal approbation in 1992. It's the only place in the world where there are two conferences of women religious. And even at the 50-year anniversary of LCWR, the leaders there literally spoke out loud saying, "My hope is that we can be one someday." But up to this point, no. And yet, there was still this sense in 2005, at the 50-year anniversary, that it seems to me that the same refounding spirit that animated the conference in 1971 continues. And Margaret Brennan wrote, "And that same refounding spirit guides and promotes the context for relationships with the Vatican and ongoing conversations with diverse publics with whom we interact in the furthering of our mission." It wasn't more than 4 years later that those hopes were very much moved to the side. And this last section is Into the Crucible. The method of LCWR in 2009 that moved them into new peripheries and living their commitment. It was in 2009 that LCWR president received from the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the announcement of a doctrinal assessment of activities and initiatives of LCWR. And it was concerned with both the tenor and doctrinal content of various addresses given at annual assemblies of LCWR. And then the concern expanded to all the programs and resources of LCWR. So questions were given, answers were offered, and in 2012, the LCWR received a note that said, and they heard nothing for 3 years. And they heard then, and now we're ready to finish this. And so they went in April to a meeting of the CDF and the Conference for the Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life. And it was there that they were read out loud that the mandate had begun and that there will be a mandate for reform of LCWR, that the Archbishop delegate would be appointed and assisting bishop delegates. And as a result, all of their conferences would be scrutinized, all of their speakers would be scrutinized, how they do orientation would be scrutinized, would be looked at. And it was written, the way it was written was that in order to assist you in living out your call. The challenge was that the sisters received this news in April, on that day, at the Vatican, and we're heading home when it was already announced. The whole doctrinal assessment report mandate was on the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops website. So they arrived in the United States having reporters and everyone else read this, and they had not yet had a chance to tell their own members. So we had then a very difficult series of 6 years that took until 2015 to resolve. And with this, I want to offer just 3 points. And I've shifted this part of the presentation in light of my own participation at the Synod in October, because I think what they were doing already then is what we're now doing at the Synod. So, one, obedience had to be looked at again. And there was a lot of research done, and they consulted canon lawyers, theologians. How do we look at dissent? The whole sense of conscience and what Gaudium Spes says, what Avery Dulles was saying, all of these theologians, they went at and looked at. 2, the second point is the efforts for dialogue over the years with the CDF office, and even sickle cell at times was rebuffed repeatedly. So that this came to a head like this came out of a complete lack of communication. Lack of, do you have more questions? Can we answer anything? And then this became very publicly known. My third point, I'm just going to offer some points about the process through which LCWR walked. That was contemplative, theologically engaged, communal. It brought together solidarity with laity and religious across the globe. In some ways, all the things that Pius XII and others had hoped would happen with religious life. So, and I'm working more on this, so I just leave you with a few short examples. Silence. Media silence was held because in the sharing, they wanted to have everyone freely engage the process. And yet, Sister Marcia Allen's CSJ and Florence Deacon, a Franciscan, who were both in leadership during those times, offer this thought. The first strategy of LCWR was a careful and selective response, thoughtfully framed speech that was silent about the content of conversation. But there was more. It was a silence that moved to contemplation before a reality too immense to comprehend, much less articulate. To become mute, says the theologian Denny Turner, is to go silent and wait for a new language to express itself. This happens when the enormity of circumstances renders one speechless. The enormity of the report and the mandate we received during our April visit to the CDF, and then its reposting on the USCCB website, before we even had time to alert our members, was such an event. Like the three Marys at the tomb, we began the journey in the deep silence of contemplation. To give you an indication of what was said to them, we were stunned by the charges of doctrinal error, critiques and judgments about perceived policies of corporate dissent, our fidelity to radical feminism, and a distortion of our faith in Jesus and his loving Father, as well as in the revealed doctrines of the Holy Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and the inspiration of sacred Scripture. To this was added the charge that we were silent on life issues such as abortion and euthanasia. They didn't mention the life issues that had been named. Communal discernment process. They had a facilitator whose job was to help them maintain interior freedom. And the sister said, you know, we were so tempted to also speak out, but a lifetime of discernment and living out the spiritual life had taught us that self-knowledge reveals the redeeming need for compassion and forgiveness, beginning with oneself. And I'm simply going to read this piece because it reminds me very much of the process used in Conversation of the Spirit in the Synod here. This is the template of the general process used and adapted. Engage in a period of silence. Invite each person to share from the heart how she is feeling. Engage in a second period of silence, reflecting on, what did I hear in the group sharing? Invite each person to share with the whole group, what did I hear in our sharing? At this point, name what is drawing my attention most strongly. What moved me? What gives me hope? They concluded each time by asking questions, what is the best outcome? What's the hoped for outcome? What does whatever group need to know or do? This is all in a powerful book called However Long the Night. And this was used by LCWR presidents at board meetings, regional meetings, at annual assemblies with almost 1,000 people gathered at tables in circles. In the waiting, though, and this is my last point here, came some of the unexpected graces. The religious said, we will stay in this process as long as our integrity is not compromised. And when it is, we will have to stop. And there are a variety of times where the edges came. But in the waiting came some of the unexpected graces, and one was in the person of Archbishop Sartain of Seattle. He was the bishop delegate appointed to journey with LCWR. And Sister Sharon Holland, IHM, who worked for Sickle Cell and is a canon lawyer, said he broke the pattern of institutionalized perceptions. He asked for understanding. He read books and articles. He he asked for resources for LCWR to help him understand how LCWR congregations had gone about the renewal called for by Vatican Council II. To this we may add, he also broke through our institutionalized perceptions of how a delegate of CDF would proceed. So the National Office prepared executive summaries of important books, delivered them, and discussed with the Archbishop. He did not assume he knew us well. He did not assume he had all the necessary information in the assessment. He took his role seriously and was trying to understand from our vantage point. And this is to Orm Rush's comment yesterday. Throughout the process, he worked tirelessly to translate understanding between CDF and LCWR. His own personal integrity allowed this to happen. And so what you saw was their own growth. And here, near the end, I say, we slowly realized that the CDF personnel wanted to find a way to conclude the process as much as we did. We needed to show that the concerns of the mandate had actually been addressed. It was no longer useful for us to insist that there had never been a cause for a mandate in the first place. You start seeing groups needing to engage. What was the result? On April 16th, 2015, 50 years after Vatican II concluded, the joint final report was issued. Those who are familiar with procedures of the Roman Curia will recognize that the results of a CDF study of the doctrinal stances of an individual or group normally end with a statement from the dicastery. This ended with a joint statement that they both wrote together, and it closed with a gathering with the Pope and photos, and that had not happened in a long time. So as I conclude, you know, these are the stories that they decided to put in writing, because they said, in a nation torn, in a world so torn by hate, war, and divisions, this is 2018, such a story can seem small, and yet no life is small, and every lesson learned has value. So I found that myself in a very liminal space then at the Synod Assembly, because some of these very pieces and conversations were happening. I'm going to close with just a picture. These are some of the people. On the left is Mary Daniel Turner and Mary Luke Tobin in her younger and her wisdom years. And on the far right is Margaret Brennan, who actually, if you know the work of Sandra Schneider, she's the one who decided in a congregation of 1,200, let's have one for every 100 train as a theologian. And Sandra Schneider's ended up being one of them. So, but where do we close? We close with this here. Maybe not. All right. We close as we began with the hope for more collaboration across congregations. Sister Carol Zinn, who's now the executive director of LCWR, just in June this year was with CLAR, the Conference of Leaders of Religious in Latin America, wondering how together they might, as religious, respond to the signs of the times in our divided world. They found themselves saying, there's more, and we can do this together. So what came as move out of your own lenses and move to something bigger is actually continuing, just differently. Thank you. Danke.